Hey there, biologists. For this set of notes, we are going to focus on Unit 5, ATP and cellular respiration, which is learning targets 4 through 7. If you want to pause and read through the learning targets, you may. So let's start with a brief review. What is the equation for photosynthesis? And for what main purpose do cells photosynthesize? Pause the video and see if you can answer these questions from memory. Let's see how you did. So hopefully you recognize that photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide, water, and light energy, and the product is oxygen and glucose. Now when you think about of these two products, what is the main purpose that plants are photosynthesizing? Hopefully you recognize that the main answer is to produce glucose. They use that glucose to grow, for example. So imagine you eat that plant. Great, you have glucose. But what exactly do we do with glucose? Now that you've consumed it, how do your cells use that molecule? We're going to start with an analogy to introduce the basics of this process before we dive into the science of cellular respiration. So the analogy we're going to use is, imagine you want to buy a bag of chips from a vending machine for $1, but all you have is a $100 bill. And if you use that $100 bill in that machine, you don't get change back. Is that an efficient transaction? Would you want to lose $99 on one bag of chips? Probably not. That's a lot of waste of money. This same analogy applies to cells and how they use energy as a form of currency. So in our cash analogy, you would take the $100 bill, you might bring it to an ATM, and then you could get lots of dollar bills back. The same process happens in our cells, using different terms other than money and ATMs. In science, in our cells, what's happening is that you consume a glucose molecule. That glucose molecule goes into the mitochondria, which is the ATM in this analogy. Do you remember how when we were learning about cell parts, you learned about how the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell and how it makes energy? This is that process. It is taking a glucose molecule and it's going to break that glucose molecule down into smaller forms of currency. And that molecule that is the smaller currency is called ATP. So let's learn more about this ATP molecule and how exactly it provides energy. So if you take a look at this molecule of ATP, it's a lot more complex than the very simple glucose molecule. So although it carries less energy, its structure is still more complex. The A in the ATP stands for adenosine, which is the majority of this compound. So adenosine refers to the adenine group, which is a nitrogen base, and you can tell that it's a nitrogen base because there's lots of nitrogen in it. And the ribose part is the 5-carbon sugar. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The TP indicates the 3 phosphates, triphosphate, and these 3 phosphates carry energy within the bonds between them. Usually only the outermost bond breaks between the 2nd and the 3rd phosphate to release energy or spend energy for cellular work. So what is an example of how this works? How is the ATP molecule used for energy? Well, we've learned about the sodium-potassium pump, which is an example of active transport, where molecules have to spend energy in the form of ATP to push molecules against their concentration gradients. In this example, we see ATP will bond to the sodium-potassium pump. The bond will break between the 2nd and the 3rd phosphate, and that process releases energy, which allows the shape of the proton pump channel to change, thus allowing the molecules to move against their gradients in and out of the cell. So that is one of many examples of how ATP is used in your cell for energy. So essentially, when ATP is used, the bond between the 2nd and 3rd phosphate groups is broken and energy is released. The remaining molecule is still adenosine, but now it has 2 phosphates. So now it is called adenosine diphosphate. So make sure you write down that ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. Make sure you label your diagram. What also remains is 1 phosphate group. This is an inorganic phosphate, just 1 phosphate group here. So if we think about this in the context of a battery, an ATP molecule is much like a rechargeable battery. Its energy can be used by the cell when it breaks apart into ADP. So we start with our charged battery, our ATP molecule. And then when that energy is released, for example, for fueling the sodium-potassium pump, we then have a discharged dead battery. And we have ADP and inorganic phosphate remaining. So this PI represents the I for inorganic in the phosphate group. Now this ADP molecule can be recharged. These molecules don't just disappear. they're still floating around inside the cytoplasm of the cell. So these molecules will then travel to the mitochondria, and energy will be put into this process in the mitochondria to recharge that ATP molecule. What essentially happens is the mitochondria assists with the process of basically plugging this inorganic phosphate group right back on the ADP molecule, thus creating ATP again. How much energy does it cost to do your body's work? Cool fact, a single cell in your body uses about 10 million ATP molecules per second and recycles all of its ATP molecules about every 20 to 30 seconds. That's pretty amazing. So how exactly do we recharge ADP to make ATP? This is the process called cellular respiration. Let's go through the equation first. Cellular respiration requires glucose, 6 molecules of oxygen, 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water molecules, and then produces 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, and produces ATP at the end. Please pause the video, make sure you get this down. Cellular respiration in a nutshell. This process is aerobic. What that means is that oxygen is required in order for this process to occur. Again, you can see that oxygen is a reactant, so therefore these two molecules are required for cellular respiration to happen. There are 3 major stages that take place in the cellular respiration process. We are not going to cover these 3 steps in depth, but you can expect that you would learn these in an AP class or college level biology class. So someday you might learn this content more in depth when you go to college. The process of glycolysis actually first starts in the cytoplasm of a cell and produces 2 smaller molecules, which then go into the Krebs cycle inside the mitochondria, followed by the citric acid cycle. Again, we are going to learn about them in depth. This process of cellular respiration overall occurs throughout the membranes and matrix of the mitochondria. So if you take a look at your mitochondrial structure, you have this inner membrane, which we've always drawn as kind of like a squiggle down the middle of our jelly bean shaped mitochondria. You can see that there's an outer membrane of this mitochondria, and that squiggle actually forms, there's like a fluid that fills the interior here, so it's an inner membrane. And this inner fluid, this inner space, is called the matrix. And it's in this matrix that the cellular respiration process is occurring, both in the matrix and also across the membrane of that inner membrane. How many ATP molecules can one glucose make? One glucose molecule can actually recharge about 30 to 38 ADP to ATP molecules. Only about 40% of the potential energy that's stored in that glucose is actually used to make ATP. So 60% of that process approximately is lost as heat as a result of these chemical reactions. So again, when you think about this analogy we were using before, you start with our charged battery, you use the battery, and then you recharge it. What we're using to recharge it is that mitochondria, that powerhouse that we've learned about before. What types of organisms undergo cellular respiration? Another way to think about this is, which organisms do you think would need $1 bill energy currency for fueling processes in their cell? Is it A, bacteria, B, plants, C, animals, D, all of the above, or E, B and C only? The correct answer is all of the above. All of these organisms require ATP in order to process and create chemical reactions and do their jobs. Now, you might be remembering that bacteria, which are very simple unicellular organisms, they do not have mitochondria. So if they don't have mitochondria, how do bacteria make ATP? Cool fact here is that bacteria, even though they do not have mitochondria, the process of cellular respiration for our mitochondrial cells actually takes place in their cytoplasm and across their cell membrane. So what's really interesting to think about here is if you were to look at the structure of the mitochondria more, they have DNA inside of them. And they also perform the exact same function that bacteria do when they need to make ATP. So if you're really curious about the origins of cells and how cells evolved over time, this is an example of a hint about the evolutionary origins of mitochondria and how they evolved from bacteria. Cool fact. So if you want to do more research, let me know and I can help you. So again, all living things use ATP. Bacteria need to use ATP. Plants need to use ATP. Animals. So all of these organisms undergo the process of cellular respiration. So again, here's some more details in case you're curious. Again, you'll learn this probably in a college level bio class. So mitochondria cannot directly make ATP. So the process actually starts with digestion, where your food molecules are broken into smaller molecules by your digestive system in your stomach, and then even smaller yet within our cells. So you start with that 6-carbon glucose, that one molecule of glucose, and in the cytoplasm, the process of glycolysis occurs, which breaks that glucose molecule into 2 smaller molecules. These 2 smaller molecules then enter the mitochondria. So here's the mitochondria. The 2 smaller molecules enter the mitochondria and enter this process called the Krebs cycle, and then eventually what we call the electron transport system, or the citric acid cycle. Throughout this whole process, a range of 30 to 38 ATP are created, and the process, and what releases, here you can see that it's releasing the carbon dioxide and the water. You might know a little bit about types of organisms that don't live in oxygen-rich environments. So if this process is aerobic and requires oxygen, what about the organisms that don't live in places where there's oxygen? There are 2 types of fermentation that might occur. So lactic acid fermentation basically produces 2 ATP and 2 lactate. So it's basically a very shortened version of cellular respiration, very simplified. Only glycolysis primarily occurs, and then NAD+ regeneration. And this is an example of how bacteria make yogurt, how your red blood cells do this process because they don't have mitochondria, and your muscle cells do this when oxygen is very low and they've been working very hard. A similar process occurs with the bacteria that live in the stomach of cows. But instead of producing lactate at the end, it actually produces methanol, which is why cows fart methane gas, just in case you wanted to know. Another example of this is called alcohol fermentation. So alcohol fermentation produces 2 ATP and 2 ethanol. So it's actually quite similar to lactate fermentation, but it produces ethanol instead. This is how yeast are used to, for example, make beer and wine. So let's recap what we've learned so far about cellular respiration. The process of cellular respiration requires 1 glucose molecule, 6 molecules of oxygen gas, 6 carbon dioxide. Oh, and then it makes 6 carbon dioxide, it makes 6 water molecules, and produces 30 to 38 ATP molecules for energy. This process primarily occurs in the mitochondria. 1 glucose recharges 30 to 38 ATP. This process is aerobic. Again, it requires oxygen to occur. And all organisms need ATP, therefore all organisms undergo some form of cellular respiration. This includes plants. Let's compare and contrast the processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So I want you to observe the image on the right side of your screen, although maybe it should be on the right side. What is the relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration? When you take a look at this diagram, what 4 molecules are constantly recycled between these 2 processes? What is different between them? For example, what provides the energy to fuel photosynthesis? What is the energy produced by photosynthesis? What is the energy source for cellular respiration? What is the energy produced by cellular respiration? What organisms undergo photosynthesis, and what organisms can undergo cellular respiration? Pause the video and answer each of these questions. Before I go through the answers to these questions, let's compare and contrast the 2 equations. When you take a look at these equations, what do you notice? For example, I see energy, water, carbon dioxide makes sugar and oxygen. And then I see sugar and oxygen makes energy, water, and carbon dioxide. There's a lot that's similar here. In fact, you might notice that these equations are simply flipped. They are exact opposites of each other. What is made by the process of photosynthesis is what is required for the process of cellular respiration. The only thing that changes between these 2 equations is the type of energy that's used or produced. So for example, the energy that's used for photosynthesis is light energy. It makes sugar. Sugar goes into cellular respiration, and instead of it doesn't make light, it makes ATP. So this is the thing that changes, but otherwise these equations have a lot to do with each other. So if we go back to that last slide, right here, you can see what 4 molecules are constantly recycled. Well, carbon dioxide and water, and glucose and oxygen are constantly in a cycle between these 2 processes. The source of energy for photosynthesis is light, which produces sugar, Sugar is used for cellular respiration, and that produces ATP. And all of the other products are recycled ongoing in this process. What organisms photosynthesize? For the most part, primarily plants. But there are a few other types of organisms that have chloroplasts or chlorophyll. In very rare cases, there are types of bacteria. For example, cyanobacteria is one example where the bacterial cells contain chlorophyll. And then there are also some very rare animals. There's, for example, a type of sea slug that has a symbiotic relationship with chloroplasts and uses them for energy. Very rare. Okay, so primarily focused on plants. But when you compare that to cellular respiration, all organisms have to do it. Bacteria, plants, and animals all need ATP, so they all do that process. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the relationship between the equations. I want you to apply what you've learned to fill in this diagram. For example, what is the source of energy that goes into this organelle? So what is the name of this organelle? That would be right here. This is the name of the process. These are the two things that are cycled between this process and the next process. So see if you can fill in this diagram from memory. So pause the video. All right, let's check your answers. So the process of photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. It is fueled by light energy, water, and carbon dioxide. This process occurs in the chloroplast and produces oxygen and glucose. This process of cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria, and it produces ATP energy at the end. All right, summarize your learning by filling in this table as best as you can. I do not have answers for you for this. You need to figure it out on your own. If you have questions, send me a message. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.